When moviegoers headed into cinemas across America on September 8, 1960, they had no idea what was about to hit them. The movie Psycho, one of Alfred Hitchcock's all-time greatest creations, was new to cinemas. It was a story of Norman Bates, the man with a split personality and an unhealthy relationship with his mother, whose type of depravity had never been really explored on the big screen before. A true American monster, his violence culminating in the stabbing murder of Marion Crane, played to screaming perfection by Janet Leigh as she was confronted by the knife-wielding maniac while showering. Now that scene led to trauma so deep that many who'd seen it became terrified of entering their own bathrooms unaccompanied. The soundtrack to that moment is still used to depict violence and horror to this day. But Psycho wasn't all fiction. It was based on the very true story of a simple Wisconsin man, a man whose mother's love was all he ever wanted, and when he could no longer get it, would go to extreme and horrifying lengths to recreate it. Events that would lead to that man, Ed Gein, being tagged the Butcher of Plainfield. I'm Claire Murphy, and this is True Crime Conversations, a podcast exploring the world's most notorious crimes by speaking to the people who know the most about them. When police raided Ed Gein's property in November 1957, they would have to spend days sorting through the trophies he'd collected. Body parts were everywhere, but on closer inspection, investigators realised that wastebasket in the corner, is that made out of human skin? Several chairs had also been upholstered in what looked like human skin, and the lampshade, that was a human face. The horror of what Ed Gein had left behind in his family farmhouse led police to believe he'd murdered possibly a dozen people to create his twisted homewares. But the reality was much, much darker. Ed Gein and his influence on pop culture remains to this day, with the recent release on Netflix of Ryan Murphy's third series of monsters, The Ed Gein Story. When author Harold Schechter saw it was being released, he wondered why no one in Ryan Murphy's camp had reached out to him. After all, his book is the leading source of information about the Gein family and the events leading up to Ed Gein's arrest and subsequent conviction, where the court found him not guilty by reason of insanity. But when we sat down with him to discuss Gein's crimes, he says as soon as he saw the opening scene of Monsters, he knew they hadn't based the story on any of his work. Harold joins us now. Your name has come up pretty much in every conversation around Ed Gein, seeing as he's back in the headlines from Ryan Murphy's Monsters version on Netflix. Have you seen it yet?
Yes, I have. I saw it as soon as it dropped.
What are your thoughts?
Um, mm, well, initially when I first heard Ryan Murphy was going to be making an Ed Gein documentary, and no one had reached out to me because I don't want to sound immodest, but my book Deviant really told the Gein story for the first time, really. And yeah, I felt that no one could really make a series about Gein without referring to or using my book. Then, as soon as I started watching the series, I was upset because so little of it had to do with my book. uh, and I dropped the whole idea of any kind of legal action because the series deviates, if I can use that word, so far from the historical truth that now I've been upset because millions of people are going to think that they've seen the actual story of Ed Gein, when what they've seen is, I would estimate, 90% fabrication, possibly more. So yes, so that's my response to it.
Well, let's talk about the real story of Ed Gein then, and we'll keep referencing back to Monsters just to see where it does deviate. But I think to best understand Ed Gein, you have to understand his family background first. Can you give us a little understanding on who his parents, George and Augusta, were?
Well, one thing I discovered, actually, the Deviant was my first true crime book, and I've encountered the same thing in many books I've done since, is that uh, they were such obscure people that there's almost no record of what was going on really in the household. I mean, we know that the father, George, uh, was apparently an abusive alcoholic. We know that Augusta was a dominant figure in the household in terms of running a business. They originally had a lacrosse before they moved to Plainfield. We know that she totally dominated Ed's life, that she was a religious fanatic who drilled into him the sense that the world outside their little farmstead was kind of a Sodom and Gomorrah, that women were evil, that Ed had to protect himself from the dangers of strange women, uh, that she would hector him constantly and uh, read to him biblical passages about the evils of womanhood. So yeah, so pretty much that's really all we know about his parents and his relationship to his parents.
We see in Monsters Augusta kicking George out of the family home,
Hmm.
which obviously isn't true. I mean, for many reasons, we can fill in the blanks because Augusta was such a devout Lutheran,
Hmm.
divorce or separation wouldn't have been on the cards for her.
Yeah.
But so, what do we know of George's fate? Was he kicked out of the home?
No, no, absolutely not. Uh, I think he became increasingly a burden to Augusta because, again, his uh, uh, problem with drink made him increasingly unreliable and unable to perform a lot of the chores around the farm. But he died at home. Um, you can read his obituary in the local newspapers. So that is just one of, I would have to say, almost countless, uh, you know, uh, fabrications that the Ryan Murphy series presents.
Well, let's talk about Augusta because she does play a pivotal role in both Monsters, but in Ed Gein's life. We know that, as you mentioned, she was quite domineering, and you, in your book, step out how you've seen her role increase over George over time, in that she becomes the named proprietor of the business that they run,
Mhm.
that she is the name on the deed of the farm, the first and second farm that they end up purchasing.
Mhm.
Why do they end up in such an isolated place? Because Plainfield itself is a very small community. There's only several hundred people who live there, but the farm on which they lived was outside of that too. And in the early 1900s, there wasn't a lot of, road traffic outside these farms. It would have, been weeks for people to head out and visit them. And
Yeah.
then, they would then have to head into town for supplies. But why isolate her family from everybody?
Well, again, as you say, I mean, it's a very that part of Wisconsin, everybody's pretty isolated from each other. I think they moved there because there was this available farm with a very extensive piece of property. They thought they could make a go of it after living in the city, La Crosse. She wanted to get away from the city because, again, she felt cities were hellholes of corruption and depravity. Uh, and, the isolation suited Augusta because, again, she was very, very wary of all the people around her, and possibly she felt she could exert a more domineering influence over the lives of her family members if they lived farther apart from the community. But in general, people lived, you know, isolated lives. I mean, the Geins were an extreme case, but that part of Wisconsin is very sparsely populated. Even when I went up there in the 1980s, you could drive through very long stretches of that part of the state and never, you know, pass another car on the road. So,
So they're out there on this isolated farm. Augusta is in charge of educating her two young boys, Henry and Ed.
mhm,
We understand, as you've mentioned, that she's very strict on them as far as her religion is concerned, but she's also instilling in them, as you've also mentioned, this fear and distaste of women in general. It
Mm,
does seem that at some stage Henry does try to kind of move away from that, but Ed is a little bit different. He seems, and this is also mentioned in your book, where his school friends are concerned, that he seems like a sweet enough boy, but he struggles to make connections with people. And it turns out that his mother is also playing a role in that every friend that he makes, she
mm,
tells him that something wrong with that child's parents, or the father is immoral, or whatever it might be.
yeah.
So what kind of mental state do you think Ed Gein is in as he's growing up under the influence of his domineering mother?
Well, again, from what we know, for whatever reason, well, I think, Augusta apparently wanted to have a daughter, and there was something, and when Ed came along, Eddie came along, she was very disappointed that she hadn't given birth to a girl. Uh, Her first child was a son, Henry. And I think part of the stranglehold she kept on him involved his turning her into uh, a more feminine kind of person. There's always something, from what I understand, from having interviewed people who had known him, which I did when I did my research in Plainfield, a little bit effeminate about Ed, that made him a bit of not a laughing stock, but, sometimes a butt of cruel teasing. Um, so, so yeah, I mean, she kept, this emotional stranglehold on him. Uh, the expression being tied to her apron strings. I mean, he was really, bound to her. Um, that expression doesn't really capture the extent uh, of her hold on him. I mean, she just kept him kind of attached to her by his umbilical cord to her. So, and Henry, there is evidence that Henry was trying to pull away. Henry had, saw the kinds of conditions that his brother Ed was living under, did urge him somehow to try to achieve some kind of independence from Augusta. And again, we don't really know all the details. There's some indication that it created a certain amount of tension between them, which then, after Gein's crimes were exposed, led people to believe he murdered Henry, which I'm quite sure he did not. Uh, Again, contra season 3 of Monsters. Yeah, so, but the interesting thing is, until these sensational murderers uh, become known to the public, they're totally anonymous, obscure figures. They're complete non-entities. So, so there's no reason there would be any real biographical information about their past lives other than what they themselves might, as Ed Gein did, later tell psychiatrists or law enforcement officials. And the accounts of neighbors are very unreliable. Once Ed is revealed to be this monstrous kind of figure, everybody suddenly, is recalling, and I put that in air quotes, dealings with the family and so on and so forth. That they always knew something was really weird going on in that household and so on and so forth. But you can't take a lot of those accounts at face value.
I guess we can attribute that to Adeline as well, who is also featured in Monsters. Adeline, initially, when she's spoken to about, and if you haven't seen Monsters, she's essentially Ed Gein's girlfriend in
Mhm.
Monsters, who seems almost complicit to a point in the crimes that he's committing.
Yeah,
She's interviewed back after he is arrested in the 50s, and she says, yes, they had a 20-year-long relationship and he seemed like a sweet, nice man. But then he's interviewed not long after that and says completely the opposite, and
yeah,
that, She never had a long relationship with him and only dated him for a short period in the 50s. So those recollections, they
Yeah.
contradict themselves even at the time of his arrest.
Well, again, uh, the uh, Ed's relationship with Adeline, as it's portrayed in the TV show, is one of its more egregious features. Um, I don't mean to seem cruel about this, but if you look at photographs of the actual Adeline Watkins, she bears a striking resemblance to the actress Margaret Hamilton as the Wicked Witch of the West in The Wizard of Oz. She was apparently a little bit of a publicity hound when the media descended on Plainfield after the discovery of Ed's atrocities. I think she enjoyed the attention she was getting by claiming she had been Ed's girlfriend, which, as you say, she later retracted. There's no evidence they had much of any kind of relationship at all. I mean, he might have one time asked her to go roller skating, which was a favorite pastime of his, but that's what all it amounted to. She was not this 20-something blonde hottie who is portrayed as Gein's accomplice and conspirator and so on and so forth. Yeah, so
That just didn't happen.
no.
Well, another thing I'm guessing then didn't happen is Monsters tries to explain the motivation for Ed Gein doing what he did through Adeline in that she gives him a box with photographs
Mm,
from Nazi concentration camps of the bodies of Jewish people and a comic book
mhm,
that is basically a fictionalized tale or somewhat fictionalized tale of Ilse Koch, who was a
mhm,
German war criminal who worked in the concentration camps and committed atrocities against Jewish people.
mhm.
Um, was any of that even vaguely true? Was he at all influenced by what was happening during the Second World War?
Well, he might have. I mean, Gein was a voracious reader, not of comic books, but of these sensational, lurid men's magazines at the time. And many of them did, in fact, feature stories about hot Nazi babes torturing, not even so much committing those kinds of death camp atrocities. There are stories where they're whipping prisoners of war and so on and so forth. So uh, it, it, there is evidence that Ed was fascinated by some of those accounts that he came across in magazines. We don't know specifically that he really knew anything about Ilse Koch per se. There were a number of those female Nazis who were very notorious for having made lampshades out of human skin and so on and so forth. Again, the whole notion that he was introduced to this by Adeline Watkins, is just made up. But it is true. You even can see there are some photographs that were published in Life magazine back in 1957 when the Gein story broke. And there are photographs of the inside of his house and the incredible chaos and squalor. And there's one shot actually of a cardboard carton filled with these men's magazines. So yes, he might have read about him. He probably did read about him there.
Well, his initial foray into utilizing dead bodies for his crimes
Mhm,
was after the death of his mother, Augusta, which he seemed to take pretty hard. And if she was as dominant a force in his life as we believe she was, then
mhm,
that would have been a terrible blow for him because at that stage his father has died,
mhm,
Henry has died, and now his mother has died. So he's left on his own.
mhm,
And he does try to dig up her body, but he
mhm,
can't access her because due to the soil conditions in that
mhm,
part of Wisconsin, they sometimes will put concrete over the top to stop
mhm.
them from sinking down. So do you think had he been able to access Augusta's body and dig her up at that time, do you think he would have gone any further? Because he does then start digging up other people around her.
Hmm.
Do you think he would have gone further had he been able to access his mother's body initially?
Hmm. I've never thought of that. Um, well, very possibly no. Is one of the major problems I have with the TV series is it portrays Ed Gein as a serial killer, and Ed Gein was not a serial killer. The term serial killer, as I'm sure you know, was coined specifically to apply to people like John Wayne Gacy and Ted Bundy, what used to be called lust murderers in the old days, extreme sexual sadists who derive their uh, perverse ecstatic pleasure from abducting and torturing and then murdering victims. That was not Ed's MO. Ed was essentially a necrophile. The two women he killed, the tavern keeper Mary Hogan and the hardware store owner Bernice Worden, he executed very swiftly. There was no kidnapping and torturing them. He just wanted their bodies to bring back home and his major motivation seemed to have been this effort to resuscitate his mother. Well, there's a dual motivation. He's acting out this, again, to play armchair Freudian psychoanalyst,
Mhm.
this deep ambivalence towards this woman, towards his mother. The one hand, he consciously sees her as a saint, uh, and his only friend, and he wants to bring her back to the farmhouse, to live with her. At the same time, he's obviously acting out these homicidal impulses towards the body in terms of the mutilations he performs. So all his efforts, had to do with getting his mother's body back. And since he couldn't access it, trying to somehow reconstitute it from the body parts of these other women. So whether or not he would have been satisfied if he had been able to bring Augusta back, again, I'd never thought of that. It's an interesting question. Again, we can only speculate.
Mm. Well, can we talk a little bit about the things he was doing with the bodies? You say it was to reconstitute his mother, essentially, but in amongst all of that, in the Monsters series, there is a big connection with femininity. And as you mentioned, he was a more effeminate young man, and potentially his mother had almost groomed him into being the
Mhm.
daughter that she actually wanted. And
Mhm.
there's this exploration of his gender and his obsession with women's undergarments and women's bodies, and the fact that he does essentially make a skin suit
Yeah.
out of women's body parts that he has allegedly worn at some stage. There is also a conversation in Monsters that he has a fictional conversation with a trans activist who explains he's not trans, but he's actually just obsessed with femininity and women's bodies. But do you think that was true in that he was very concerned about what gender he was supposed to be and that kind of navigation of who he really was, and that's what he was doing with those bodies too?
Well, that's probably part of it. When you say Gein made a skin suit, of course, that's where Thomas Harris got the idea for his Buffalo Bill character in Silence of the Lambs. It wasn't a whole suit. The investigators who first were digging up all these horrible body parts and so on in his farmhouse came upon what they called a mammary vest. So he had apparently flayed the top part of a woman's torso with a breast and made, you know, strung it with some kind of cords that he could put on his own body, which definitely suggests that obviously in my book, again, written in 1987, published in 1989, I use the term transvestite, which you don't hear too much anymore.
Mm-hmm.
But I say that he was somebody who dressed up in women's skin instead of women's clothing. So again, it's hard. Freud uses the term overdetermined, which means there's no one simple uh, cause of behavior. You can see in that, again, both his evidence to recreate his mother, as well as to be, the girl that his mother always wanted to have. The thing about Ed Gein, I was talking about this actually to somebody the other day. it's impossible to explain his behavior ultimately. We all want to, in a way, reduce this unimaginable kind of human behavior to something we can grasp with our rational minds, because it gives us a sense of control over it. But I'll often say, it's as hard to understand. It's as hard to understand Ed Gein as it is to understand Mozart. That there are certain, certain human beings who, whose minds and motivations are just beyond the ability to understand. So all those factors obviously played into creating the creature we know as Ed Gein. But trying to reduce it to some kind of simple explanation is just not possible. I sometimes think that the conditions of his life caused something to crack in his psyche, and all this archaic stuff, you know, uh, having to do with flaying victims and wearing their skins and making trophies out of body parts, things you see in archaic religions, somehow flooded out in that little Wisconsin farmhouse. It's one of the things that makes the case so endlessly fascinating, is that in the 1950s, in the midst of this bland, balmy, you know, America that's been mythologized as happy days, everybody living in nice suburban houses surrounded with white picket fences and sitting around on Sunday nights and watching I Love Lucy and so on and so forth. In the middle of the American heartland, there was this person who, the squalor and darkness of his little hovel, was enacting, these archaic rituals of, as I said, like an Aztec priest dressing up in human skin, or like going back to our prehistoric ancestors, dissecting the bodies of their victims, shrinking their heads, keeping body parts as trophies. So,
Can we talk about the things that were found in Ed Gein's house when he is finally arrested? He's arrested at a neighbor's house having dinner, and it's after he murders Bernice, which she's the local hardware store owner. In the movie, it's suggested that they had a relationship, a sexual relationship, and then he, in his schizophrenic state, believes that she's given him a venereal disease, and that's why he goes and murders her, which none of that is true, right? Or as far as we know, because we're not inside Ed Gein's head
no,
at any
it's
stage,
complete.
none of that is true.
Yeah, no, none of it's true. It's complete outrageous lie. And somebody said apparently Bernice Worden's uh, uh, relations, descendants, are very upset about that. I mean, Gein had no contact with her at all. I mean, apparently the day before he killed her, he had come into the hardware store and sort of joshingly asked her if she wanted to go roller skating. But the portray it's really kind of unconscionable what Ryan Murphy and his collaborator Ian Brennan did. Something like that, where there still are family members. I'm not even sure how they could get away with that without being sued in some way. But
There's
uh,
even a suggestion that Bernice's son is absent in her life and is not, and she's very sad and lonely, but wasn't he the local deputy and raised
yeah,
the alarm after she went missing? Like, none of her story seems to be true.
no, none of it's true. I mean, literally, none of
I
it
mean,
is.
other than working in the hardware store, that seems to be the
Yeah,
only
yes,
true
exactly.
thing.
Yeah,
Yeah.
no, none of it.
So after Ed kills her and takes her back to the property at the farm, police quickly find out that he is a suspect because the son does mention that he's come into the store and has kind of said a few things to her. And they find him having dinner at a neighbor's house and they arrest him. And then they go and they raid his home. What do they find inside the Gein house?
Well, first of all, they find Bernice Worden's body in the summer kitchen adjacent to the house, um, strung up, beheaded, strung up, dressed out like a deer, the body hollowed out of all its internal organs. They find her head, which Gein had inserted. He'd taken a couple of nails and bent them to make them into hooks and inserted one in each ear with a rope between them. He was apparently intending to hang that up as a trophy on his wall. Inside the house proper, they found uh, bowls made out of the caps of human skulls. They found a box full of vulvas, which had been painted silver. They found a belt made of nipples, a shade pole made of human lips. They found that mammary vest that we spoke about before. They found a number of flayed faces. Ed had flayed the faces off of some of these corpses and dried them out and hung them on his bedroom wall. Again, these incomprehensible horrors. So,
Did police ever talk?
they also at some point found Mary Hogan's. Ed would sometimes joke around, "Oh, I got her at home." Nobody took him seriously, but
Hmm,
they found her head in a paper bag.
I can't imagine what that must have been like for the police who were investigating this. Do they ever speak about the impact that finding all of this had on them mentally?
Well, I don't know that they spoke about the long-term effect, but yeah, um, uh, yes, one can only imagine. Um, I think the horrors were so, again, incomprehensible that they couldn't even really process what they were finding, you know. Um, uh, Gein is really unique, as far as I know, not only in the annals of American crime, but in the annals of world crime. People have kept body parts as, serial killers have kept body parts as souvenirs and so on and so forth. Um, but nobody did what Gein did. Well, yeah. I mean, Gein, again, he was essentially a necrophile, but he was less a necrophile who was interested in having sex with the corpses. Although, again, Ryan Murphy's show does portray him as having sex with the corpses, which, as far as we know, he never did. Um, as somehow using their body parts as raw material for these home improvement projects somehow. It makes him a very American kind of necrophile.
When he's arrested, what does he say to police? How does he tell them what he's done? Does he admit to it initially?
Well, no, not initially. When you read Gein's confessions, uh, he's the his interrogators ask him all these leading questions, which he admits to. So they'll say, "So, Ed, we found this we found this weird vest, made out of the top part of a woman's body. And did you put it on and pretend you were your mother?" And he'd say, "Yeah, that sounds about right." Later on, when he was institutionalized and people would interview him, he would deny almost everything uh, without ever really explaining how all those artifacts ended up in his farmhouse. Um, but yeah, he did admit, or at least he did not deny that he had done all these things.
Well, can we talk about a lot of the other things that Monsters claims he did?
Mhm.
There's a disappearance of 15-year-old Evelyn, who in the story was recovering from polio, and so Ed Gein had stepped in to babysit the children she normally babysat, but then she recovered and returned, and he resented that. And the monster show suggests that he kidnapped and murdered her. Is the only truth I can find to that is that he, yes, at some stage babysat children to supplement income from the for the farm, and that was about it.
Well, Evelyn Hartley was a young girl who disappeared while babysitting. Uh, After Gein's horrors were discovered, as is often the case when some sensational murders have been uncovered, police officers with unsolved cases flocked to Plainfield, hoping to be able to close out these cold cases. One of them was the Evelyn Hartley case. Uh, but yeah, Gein evidently had nothing at all to do with the disappearance of Evelyn Hartley. Abducting teenage girls and torturing them and killing them again was not what Gein was all about. It was not his MO. He was not a serial sex killer, which is what the show makes him out to be. And at the end of the show, it makes him out to be sort of the forefather of all these notorious serial killers who appeared back in the 70s and supposedly were inspired by Gein, which is, again, what can I say? Just yet another complete fabrication.
Is that why we see that scene when he's confronted by two hunters in that little outhouse where you talked about Bernice being strung up like a deer, and then he chases them into the woods with a chainsaw and murders them, which essentially tries to explain the influence on the Texas Chainsaw Massacre movie, but there's no evidence that that ever happened, right?
No, again, the two hunters, uh, hunters were always getting killed during deer hunting season for one reason or another. Yes, that's complete. I guess I have to use the word lie. Gein, there's no evidence Gein ever owned a chainsaw. So,
Right.
I mean, after the Gein crime, the Gein crimes became known to most of America because shortly after they came to light, Life magazine, which was essentially this photo journalistic magazine that at the time could be found in almost every middle-class American household, did a big spread on the Gein crimes. And supposedly Toby Hooper, who was young at the time, he would have been about, I guess, he was sort of my age, would have been about 9 or 10, read about it and was kind of permanently traumatized by it and recollected the story when he went to make Texas Chainsaw Massacre. But the chainsaw thing, yeah, that Gein did not dismember any victims with chainsaws, and he didn't kill those two hunters. So yes, that's another thing. Yeah, most of it, what they did was what Murphy and Brennan did was take the broad outlines of the Gein story and then just fill it in with whatever they thought was going to titillate an audience for a few hours. I sometimes think of it as a throwback to the kinds of biopics that were made in Hollywood back in the 1930s and 40s. The story of Louis Pasteur, or, the story of Thomas Edison, or the story of whoever. They take the very broad outlines and just make stuff up to keep the audience entertained. So, I mean, Monster, as I said, it's a particularly egregious example of that kind of thing. So little of it is based on historical fact. Really, you could name the few things that were based on historical fact, like there was an Ed Gein. He did, rob graves. He did have this weird relationship with his mother. Actually, as soon as I turned it on, the first scene, which shows him engaging in autoerotic asphyxiation,
Mm.
as soon as I saw that, I thought, okay, I don't have a legal case anymore.
So that a lot of that, what happened behind closed doors in that farmhouse,
Yeah.
essentially has to be made up because we don't really know what life was like for them behind closed doors, right?
But the fact that he helped solve the Ted Bundy case,
Mm.
I mean, you name it, it didn't happen. So,
What was life like for Ed Gein after he was arrested and institutionalized? Because they did find him insane. And I know they did try to bring him to court, to trial, but again, he was found insane. So, what was life like for him? Did his mental health decline? Did it stabilize? What was it like for him when he was
I think
arrested?
actually, from what I know, and I actually know at least one person who visited him in the institution and spoke to him. Yeah, life was much better for him once he was locked up in an institution than
Mm.
before. You know, the expression three hots and a cot, he had, meals that were much better. When he was living alone, he might open I mean, the series sort of got this part right. Open a can of baked beans, put it on the stove, then dump it into, the top part of the human skull and eat it. So he was being fed. He had surrounded by people for the first time in his life. He was given books to read. He had correspondence with people who were very sympathetic towards him. So his life was a good deal more pleasant than it had been up to that point.
What was life like for him at the end? I mean, did he pass away peacefully? Was there, I mean, unsolved things they were still trying to work out with him? What was
No,
his
I don't
life like
think.
at the end?
Yeah, yeah. Well, he had died of cancer, so I don't. I've never really come across specific information about his last days. Um, I don't think he was apparently unaware of his influence on American culture. The thing about Monster is they make it seem as though his major legacy was as I said, the forefather of the serial killers who suddenly appeared back, which is totally false. But he did have a major impact on American culture because Robert Bloch, who was a pulp horror writer, was living very close to Plainfield at the time the Gein story broke. Bloch was a protege of H.P. Lovecraft. He had become known for these pop horror stories. When he read about the Gein case, he realized this would be a great premise for a horror novel. He felt, because I corresponded with Bloch when I was writing my book. His problem was knowing how isolated Gein was. Gein never traveled anywhere. Where was he going to find all his victims? So he thought, well, I'll have the victims come to him. And that's how he came up with the idea of the Bates Motel. If you read the novel, when Norman Bates is finally arrested, he compares himself to Ed Gein. So there's a very, very explicit connection. And what I tell people, I'm a baby boomer. I grew up in the 1950s. Culture filled with, all I did was go to horror movies and watch horror movies on TV and read horror comic books. And, the culture was full of monsters, pop culture. But all the monsters were from other places. Dracula from Transylvania, or the Werewolf of London, or Creature from the Black Lagoon from deep in the Amazon, or Martian invaders. Norman Bates was the first all-American monster. And insofar as Ed Gein stood behind Norman Bates, you could say that Gein kind of Americanized the genre of horror. And that's a major, major impact. And he also, again, through Psycho, stands as, what sometimes people call the godfather of gore. The Psycho is the prototypical, what came to be called slasher or splatter movie. So Gein did have a major cultural impact, but it was on pop culture. It wasn't on, inspiring Richard Speck and Ted Bundy and Edmund Kemper and so on.
So I guess the legacy that Ed Gein has left behind continues then in pop culture,
Mhm.
as much as it may have been fictionalized for this instance in
Yes.
Monsters. Do you think we'll ever stop being fascinated by Ed Gein and his story?
Well, one of the reasons I was interested in the Gein story when I first discovered it is that yeah, I was a professor, college professor for 42 years, and I taught a course called Myth and Archetype, about these narrative patterns and archetypal figures that populate the folklore and literature of the world. And I've always been very interested in why we need stories about monsters in our lives from our earliest years. And Gein has become a kind of mythic monster at this point. I mean, in that sense, again, you could say Ryan Murphy and his collaborator did what people have always done with mythic monsters. If you look back at the history of the American frontier, there were these psychotic killers like Jesse James and Billy the Kid, and their stories have been incredibly mythologized by Hollywood. So there's a sense in which, yeah, I mean, you, Gein is such a mythic monster at this point that any creator, you could say, is free to tell whatever kind of story about him they want to. My main problem, my main problem with the Ryan Murphy show is that it presents it as true crime.
Mm.
You know, so yeah, so I think Gein will definitely remain an undying part of America's uh, cultural mythology.